Hey students, this is Professor Gore. We're in part two of the Religion and Reform lecture, and so we're going to cover this whole topic in three different parts, just because of the nature of the content and so forth. So what we're going to cover right now is kind of the groups that kind of were not part of the mainstream Protestant Christianity, like the Transcendentalists, which were a growing popular number, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and some other different sects and so forth. So now, eventually, the Mormons would grow to be a very large group and denomination and so forth. But at this time, at this point in history, they were relatively small considering the overall population. So basically, this rapid economic development that we've covered in the chapter about the tremendous market and first phase industrial revolution and so forth did have some backlash. And so you do have some it kind of weakened some traditional institutions and social rules, forcing individuals to kind of fend for themselves. And one of the things that came about was a French sociologist comes and visits the United States during the Jacksonian era, during the 1830s, and he kind of observed the United States because countries like France and others were really kind of fascinated about American democracy because they hadn't really seen anything like that. Because Britain did have democracy with parliament, but also had a monarchical king, and so the United States didn't have that. We had an elected president, and they were just kind of blown away and fascinated by what was happening in the United States, and so de Tocqueville kind of witnessed a few things, and I've covered that in a different lecture, some of the observations that he made when he came to the United States. But one of the terms that he kind of coined when he came to the United States was what's called individualism, to describe a lot of this social world of native-born white Americans. Now, obviously with slavery, you don't have that for the enslaved population. So let's talk about the Transcendentalist group. So you can't understand Transcendentalism in American history unless you understand Ralph Waldo Emerson. So Emerson, who ended up living from 1803 to 1802, kind of celebrated this liberation from traditional constraints. He kind of argued that every person kind of had this inner light, and and kind of reliance on self that can be used to better society. And so his most famous work is what's called self-reliance, about that you can rely on yourself to kind of better the world around you. And Emerson's vision of individual freedom influenced thousands of ordinary Americans and a generation of important artists. He was a leader, figurehead of this Transcendentalist movement, which was an intellectual movement. And so it really impacted the educated kind of middle class in New England part of the country, but also some other parts of the country that were that read some of his writings. Now, today, I would say that Henry David Thoreau in the 2000s is probably the most well-known transcendentalist, because a lot of high school students have to read Walden, or they've learned about Thoreau's book Civil Disobedience, which influenced Dr. King with the Civil Rights Movement. But at that time, Emerson was by far the most well-known and influential transcendentalist. So one of the things that you'll see is that it first advocates where kind of these spiritual young men, often Unitarian ministers from well-to-do New England families, they kind of really question their Puritan or Congregationalist heritage. And so that's where you see this Transcendentalist movement emerge. Emerson was originally a Congregationalist minister, and kind of left that religious belief and heritage to kind of form this new Transcendentalist movement. They were inspired by Europe, like a lot of American movements. The First Great Awakening started in Europe. The Enlightenment started in Europe. The Scientific Revolution started in Europe. Transcendentalism also started to a certain degree in Europe. And so it was a new concept of self and society that rejected the ordered, rational world of the 18th century Enlightenment. They wanted to capture the passionate aspects of the human spirit, and which is kind of interesting. And they also wanted to gain a deeper insight into the mysteries of existence. I know it sounds confusing, but the main thing, if you can remember nothing else about Transcendentalists, remember this. They believed that they had the inward ability to reform society around them. Now, the mainstream Protestant Christianity also had that, but that they kind of had a different interpretation of how you do that, where mainline Protestant Christians argued that it's through the power of God. And Christians believe that if you're a Christian, you have this inward Holy Spirit that can helps you to perfect yourself and the society around you. The Transcendentalists believe that they did believe in God. They believe that God kind of gave you this inner light, and that through your own self-reliance, kind of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, kind of that American culture that helped shape the Transcendentalist movement, that you could better the society around you. And so a lot of these Unitarianists that became Transcendentalists believe that they could use their own intuition and transcend the limits of ordinary existence and come to know the infinite and the eternal. Unitarians believe that God was a single being, not a trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that's not mainstream Protestant Christianity by any means. Emerson left his parish and moved to Concord, Massachusetts to articulate the philosophy of Transcendentalism. He argued that people needed to get rid of inherited customs and institutions and kind of rely on themselves. His essays and lectures suggested that all nature was saturated with the presence of God, at kind of a pantheistic spiritual outlook. And so pantheism is believed that God is in everything. And so if you look at Emerson, he was definitely not a Christian in terms of religious belief. So I took a world religions class in college. And so Transcendentalism is kind of this own unique thing. One of the things, too, is Emerson also wanted his readers, kind of warned his readers that the new market society was diverting the nation's spiritual energy, and that the preoccupation with work, profits, and the consumption of factory-made goods would hurt Americans spiritually and physically. So it is challenging what is emerging from the first industrial revolution, the first phase industrial revolution. And so you have Transcendentalists is probably the most well-known group that kind of rebelled against the culture and capitalism and consumerism that emerged from the first phase industrial revolution. And so he spread his message through essays and public lectures. These public lectures have become a spectacularly successful way of spreading information and fostering discussion among the middle classes. Beginning in 1826, the Lyceum movement promoted organized lectures from poets, preachers, and scientists and reformers. Now, it may be hard to imagine, but one of the ways that people wanted to learn is they would have these traveling lectures, and they would have these guest speakers, and you could actually go, usually for free. It would be funded through philanthropy. You might pay a small fee at some of them, but you could go learn a lecture on biology or transcendentalism or whatever you wanted to learn about if they had one near you. And so these kind of lecture movement became an important cultural institution in the North and Midwest, but didn't travel to the South, where popular education was a lower priority, and apologists for slavery discouraged open discussions of controversial ideas. And so, Emerson, I can't understate his popularity. He gave about 1,500 lectures in 20 states. So this dude was the man up in the North and the Midwest at this time. And he celebrated individuals who rejected traditional social restraints, but retained both self-discipline and civic responsibility. One of his most famous things was what's called the American Scholar. Okay? And so you can see his three most famous works: Nature, Self-Reliance, and American Scholar. And then, of course, Thoreau wrote Walden. It's a pretty boring book. I hope you don't have to read it in high school. I didn't have to read it in high school English, but Resistance to Civil Disobedience, that was written during right after the Mexican War, and we'll cover that in Module 4. So there's Emerson on the left and Thoreau, which is interesting beard on the bottom left. So it was actually started in Europe by Immanuel Kant, famous philosopher. So if you ever take a philosophy class at some point, you'll talk about Kant. And that's kind of interesting. Also, for women, Margaret Fuller was the most famous transcendentalist for women. And so let's talk about Thoreau and Fuller for a second. And so Thoreau particularly kind of became a leading transcendentalist, but definitely was a lesser in terms of popularity to Emerson when he kind of turned away from society and embraced the natural world. He lived alone by Walden Pond, which in Massachusetts, where he wrote Walden, and it's a very famous tourist spot. Although I read an article recently that people are trashing it and damaging it to a certain extent. He also wrote another famous work called Life in the Woods. But Civil Disobedience is the one he's most known for today because of how it is influenced with the civil rights movement that emerges later. Now, Margaret Fuller was also influenced by Emerson's teachings, and she became a leading transcendentalist for women, and really became the most influential transcendentalist woman. She edited the Transcendentalist journal, The Dial, and also published Women in the 19th Century. And she really kind of was forthright in noticing that she predicted a new era were coming relations between men and women, and she was right. It's just going to be several decades on down the road. But women's roles will change as a result of the Second Great Awakening, and she was correct about that. Another famous writer at this time was Walt Whitman, and he also had served as a male nurse during the American Civil War for the North and witnessed some great atrocities. But he is arguably the most famous, at least writer or poet of the 1800s in American history. And if he's not considered the most famous or most well known, he's at least in the top three. And so, one of the things about Whitman, he also favored women's rights, but he was an editor for the Brooklyn Eagle, which was a publication for the Democratic Party. His most famous poem, and he's got a ton, is Leaves of Grass, written in 1855, right before the Civil War. But he wrote about human suffering with passion, and he also laces accounts of transcendence with the twinges of anxiety. And his writings tended to be perverted at times, but he did support women's rights. And so, despite some of his perversion stuff, he's kind of seen fondly by a lot of historians. So in some textbooks call him the poet laureate of democracy, because he really had deep love for the masses, and particularly those who suffered during the American Civil War. So let's talk about American literature as well. And really what you see in Module 3 is, before the War of 1812, there really wasn't a distinctly American literature, because our literature was still very much European. It looked just like any other British literature or whatever. But after the War of 1812, with this nationalism and patriotism that emerges, you start seeing uniquely American literature. You see that with Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper in the late 1810s and 1820s. But even in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, you see some other famous American writers, and some of these books are some of the most famous books in American history. And so, why were literature and books and newspapers so widely read? Well, because if you go back to Module 1, you have these Puritans and other religious groups wanted everybody in their congregation to read the Bible, so that we had probably the most literate population anywhere in the world. Doesn't mean everybody in the country was literate, but you had a greater percentage of people who could read and write than anywhere else in the world. And so the number of newspaper readership grew from 1,200 in 1833 to 3,000 in 1860. That's more than double. And of course, our population doubles every 25 years as part of it, but that shows you that new population that is emerging from either immigration or reproduction is wanting to read. And so they read a lot of these famous novels by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The Scarlet Letter, some of you may have had to read that in high school English. One of his is probably his most famous work. They've even made a book or a movie. It's kind of a modern day interpretation of it. It's called The Easy A, starring Emma Stone. And then you also have Herman Melville, who there's been a couple of movies made based on this book called Moby Dick, and this hunt for the famous white whale or whatever, this fictional whale in the story. But Melville, growing up in the New England area, a lot of people along the coast were in the whaling industry, and so why would that people hunt whales in the Atlantic Ocean? The reason for that is they would kill the whale, and then they would use their whale fat. It was very profitable, and make it into kerosene for lanterns. And so, in fact, a lot of runaway slaves, African American males particularly, when they fled to New England, would end up working in the whaling industry. So here's Herman Melville up in the top right, Nathaniel Hawthorne's at the top or the bottom right, and then you have Edgar Allan Poe that emerges. And then also Emily Dickinson, and I'm sorry her name got cut off there on that slide, but Emily Dickinson was kind of a troubled woman who ended up kind of dying somewhat depressed and ill. Edgar Allan Poe also struggled with depression, especially after his wife and child died. But these were famous American writers, and so Emily Dickinson's famous, really her poems became famous after her death. And Edgar Allan Poe kind of created the first modern detective story in American history, at least. I'm sure there were some British counterparts, but I had to read several of his short stories in English, both in high school and college. Telltale Heart, Quoth the Raven Nevermore, among others. They're kind of somewhat depressing, but he was a talented writer. All right, let's talk about utopian communities. The first we're going to talk about is Brook Farm, and we'll cover the United Community as well. So Brook Farm was a group, and all these utopian communities are trying to escape society and culture and the economy of the first phase of industrial revolution. They were fed up with this consumerism and this wage earning, and a lot of them were educated, but they had money to be able to support themselves. A lot of them died out because they couldn't support themselves, like they weren't farmers or whatnot. So to escape the constraints of Americans' emerging market society, these transcendentalists and other radical reformers created ideal communities, or what we called utopias. They hoped that these planned societies, which organize life in new ways, would allow their members to realize their spiritual and moral potential. So really, how does Brook Farm make it? It is in Massachusetts. It was just outside of Boston. It was founded in 1841. It does not last. In fact, it only lasted for about 5 years. The only reason why it lasted is because wealthy transcendentalists in Boston would help fund it. But these were educated scholars who didn't know how to farm. You can't have a community that can't feed itself if you don't know how to farm. So they, anyway, they hoped, these residents hoped to escape the ups and downs of the market economy by becoming self-sufficient in food and exchanging their surplus milk, vegetables, and hay for non-agricultural goods. But anyway, they had few farming skills, and when the community caught on fire in 1846, investors ended up selling the farm. So it ended up failing. Now, one thing I did forget to mention is that transcendentalists also favored abolition of slavery, which is pretty cool. So anyway, Brook Farm, utopia community founded by the transcendentalists, failed. Okay, had trouble feeding themselves, had a bad fire that emerged. All right. So even as Brook Farm collapsed, thousands of Americans were joining these communal settlements in the Northeast and the Midwest. They weren't happening in the South primarily. And these communalists were farmers and artisans. Artisans means, like a blacksmith or a carpenter or somebody that had a skilled trade. And they were seeking refuge and security during the 7-year economic depression that began the Panic of 1837. And that one we'll cover in a different lecture. But these rural utopias were symbols of social protest and experimentation. But you got to realize these are very, very much minority movements in American history. But because they're kind of fascinating and interesting, they're often remembered. And it shows that these fringe groups weren't always on board with whatever else with the mainstream American society was going with. So by prescribing the common ownership of property and unconventional forms of marriage and family life, communalist leaders and their followers challenged the legitimacy of capitalistic values and traditional gender roles. And so as you have this emerging, you still in the East have tens of thousands of immigrants coming. A lot of Irish, a lot of Germans, other British, people from Scandinavia, Northern and Western Europeans were coming at this time and pouring in the United States because of economic opportunity and the chance to own cheap, available land. But they, one of the things that you'll see emerge is that this popular culture did kind of repudiate its customary social norms, but it also reinforced traditional racist feelings. For instance, they weren't opening to all races and ethnic groups, and encourage new styles of dress and behavior. Now, my personal favorite utopia community is the Shakers. And the reason why is because of their religious services, they would dance. And they were called the Shakers because oftentimes would shake. And so it reminds me of a junior high dance because you had women who would dance in this one area and then men would dance in another area. And sometimes women would dance in the middle, and men would dance around the outside. So the reason why junior high dance, because most junior high boys don't have the confidence to go up and talk to many girls. So the girls usually will dance with other girls as their friend group, and the boys are kind of just over there trying to play cool because they lack the self-confidence to go over there. So, but the fact that men and women are separated, I can't help but notice that like a junior high dance. So The Shakers were founded by this lady named Mother Ann. Her name was actually Anne Lee Stanley, and she actually was born in Manchester, England. And so she, and this is pretty crazy, but she claimed that she had a vision that she was an incarnation of Christ, and that Adam and Eve had been banished from the Garden of Eden because of their sexual lust. This is kind of interesting. 4 years later, she led a band of 8 followers to America, where they established a church near Albany, New York. Because of the ecstatic dances that were part of their worship, they were called the Shakers. And when Mother Ann died, her followers viewed her as a second coming of Christ. Okay, so this is very much like a cult movement. The Shakers withdrew from their profane world and formed disciplined religious communities. They embraced common ownership of property, so they were communistic, accepted the strict oversight of church leaders, and pledged to abstain from alcohol, tobacco, politics, and war. But the Shakers did not marry and did not have sexual intercourse. And so they would only gain new followers by bringing in orphans or new members. So as you can imagine, the Shakers don't make it very long in American history, because if you can't reproduce, you can't continue on. And anyway, but they did place community governments in the hands of both women and men, but maintained a traditional division of labor between the sexes. They did found about 20 communities, so the Shakers did become fairly popular to a small extent with these communities, but these 20 communities were pretty small. And the most they ever had was about 6,000 members. So if you look at the overall U.S. population, that is very much a small fringe group. And they declined after 1850 because they didn't reproduce. Anyway, so that is the Shakers. This is my favorite picture of the Shakers. Women are dancing in the middle, and the men are around the outside, and some are off to the side, like at a junior high dance. All right, so let's talk about the next group, and it's Arthur Brisbane and Fourierism by Charles Fourier. So, who's Charles Fourier? He was a French reformer who devised kind of this like theory that through 8 stages you could have social evolution, and basically predicted that capitalism and individualism would go away. That didn't happen. And according to Arthur Brisbane, this guy named Charles Fourier, who Arthur Brisbane was Charles Fourier's leading disciple in America. Fourierism would free workers from the menial and slavish system of hired labor for wages. So he was against working in factories. Just as republicanism had freed Americans from the slavish monarchical system of government, their view of how society would operate would free them from wages of industry. The members of a phalanx or cooperative group would be its shareholders, and they would own all of its property in common, including stores and a bank, a school, and a library. So they are communistic as well. Fourier and Brisbane saw the phalanx as a humane system that would liberate women as well as men. Brisbane advocated his beliefs in the social destiny of man in 1840. Many of these followers lived along the Erie Canal. Okay, so they were a utopian community along western New York. Fourierism, or Fourierist, argued that that a lot of these educated farmers and craftsmen who came to join them, particularly after the Panic of 1837. So they founded about 100 cooperative communities, mostly in western New York and the Midwest. They were very small and never gained a majority of the population in any particular county, but they really kind of collapsed because you had people who would work hard and others who would loaf and not work hard. And so that's one of the problems of communism and socialism, is that unless the government forces everybody to work hard, there's really no incentive to work harder than somebody else, which is capitalism not perfect, but it does give you incentive to work harder. All right. So one of the things that these utopia communities are going to try to combine is these things listed right here. So let's talk about the Oneida community, and their thing that their legacy today is fine china or fine porcelain. But it's founded by John Humphrey Knowles, who was both charismatic and deeply religious. He took influence from both Fourier and the Shakers that created a community that defined sexuality and gender roles in radically new ways. He was a Congregationalist minister, but eventually left that because he had kind of unorthodox views. And he began he attracted thousands of New Englanders who moved to New York and Ohio. And these people, these perfectionists, believed that Christ had returned to the earth in the second coming, and that people could therefore aspire to sinless perfection in their earthly lives. Knowles believed that marriage was the barrier for people to achieve perfection. So here's the interesting thing. He argued what's called complex marriage. Everybody is married to everybody in the community. So basically, you could sleep with whoever you wanted. He has to flee to Canada at one point for polygamy because the states had anti-polygamy laws. And anyway, one of the things that that Knowles did is he set up communal nurseries for children to be run by both men and women. There's been psychological studies that have shown that children thrive better under their parents, not a communal nursery. China tries to do this in the Great Leap Forward under Mao Zedong, and it's a disaster, and the Chinese government ends up getting rid of it. So anyway, women in these communities cut their hair short and wore pantaloons under calf-length skirts. And so he founded a community in Vermont, but got kind of ran out of town. Then he went to Oneida, New York, or Oneida, however you pronounce it. And that's where their name kind of came from. Had about 200 residents. It did become financially self-sustaining when they developed a highly successful still animal trap. The vendor of that actually moved to the community, and he's the one that created and made a lot of money, or made money off it to help support the community. But anyway, Knowles was ran out to Canada because he was getting prosecuted for polygamy and adultery. So that's the Oneida community. They believe the second coming already occurred, second coming of Jesus Christ. So they weren't obliged to follow the moral rules of the past, so they could sleep with whoever they wanted. And that's the big thing that students always remember from the United community. And then Owen Farm and so forth, another utopian community, and was socialistic. New Harmony was another utopian community. This is kind of what it looked like, or what it was supposed to look like. This is kind of what the community looked like in Indiana. All right, you also have the Seventh-day Adventist Church that emerged, and it's founded by this guy named Miller, who argued that the second coming of Christ was going to come on a specific day on October 22nd, 1843. So the people that believed in this would sold all their property and the belongings, would buy this white robe thing, and believe they were going to ascend into heaven on October 22nd, 1843. Well, when it didn't happen, he said he was mistaken. They did a second day, and it failed again. So once this failed, and he was kind of a laughingstock in the press, these Millerites formed the Seventh-day Adventist Church on October 23rd and said, "Oh, we were mistaken." So let's talk about the Mormons. They're a pretty large group today, and their famous founder, Joseph Smith, emerged. There's not really any known picture of him. I have searched and searched and searched. This is the only thing I can come up with, and I have no idea if it's actually him or not. But this is the only record of what he might have looked like, and so I apologize in advance. And I'm going to go and preface that I'm not really sure. I don't know if anybody really is for sure what he looked like. So let's talk about the Mormons. Their church is called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Sometimes it's called the LDS Church. They are a utopian community with a much more conservative social agenda. And it really were kind of the traditional patriarchal family, kind of male dominated, was different from the Mormons versus other groups that elevated women more so. Then really of all the utopian groups, the Mormons get the greatest persecution, really because of their polygamy. So let's look at who Joseph Smith was. He's actually from Vermont. Grew up in a poor farming family and a shopkeeping family. His family migrated to Palmyra, New York, near the Erie Canal. His family was actually treasure hunters. And so in a series of religious experiences that began in 1820, Smith came to believe that God had singled him out to receive a special revelation of divine truth. In 1830, he published the Book of Mormon, which he claimed to have translated from ancient hieroglyphics on gold plates shown to him by an angel named Moroni, which is where you get the term Mormon from. And so the Book of Mormon is supposed to be like from the angel Moroni, told the story of the ancient civilization from the Middle East that had migrated to the Western Hemisphere, and basically Mormons believe that Jesus Christ came to North America and evangelized Native Americans. So Smith's account provided an explanation of the presence of native tribes in the Americas and immigrated them into the Judeo-Christian tradition. So he founded the LDS Church and revived traditional social doctrines, among them patriarchal authority within the family. He encouraged frugality, hard work, and enterprise, and you see that portrayed out with Mormons today. He did advocate church discipline to the group and that would aspire moral perfection. So because they were persecuted, the Mormons kind of have to move to different parts of the country. So I'm going to show you a map here in just a minute that'll show you where they kind of bounced around. And so anyway, so the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith argued, was written on these gold tablets, and that he wasn't able to show anybody, but had written the Book of Mormon from it. And so they kind of bounce around. And so they kind of had moved from New York to Missouri to Illinois, and then they ended up going all the way out to Utah. And so by the early 1840s, Nauvoo, Illinois, had become the largest Utopian community in the U.S. with about 30,000 inhabitants, so far larger than any other Utopian community in the 1800s. This rigid discipline and secret rituals of the Mormons, along with their prosperity, hostility towards other sects, and block voting in Illinois elections, fueled resentment among their neighbors. This resentment turned to overt hostility when Smith refused to abide by Illinois' law, which he disapproved, and asked Congress to turn Nauvoo into a separate federal territory, and declared himself a candidate for president of the United States. So what ends up happening, Smith claimed to have received a new revelation that justified polygamy, which is having more than one wife. He had multiple wives, including teenage girls. But Illinois officials arrested Smith in 1844 for treason for allegedly conspiring with foreign powers to create a Mormon colony in Mexican territory. So that's where they kind of went to get arrested for. This anti-Mormon mob kind of stormed the jail. There was a shot fired into his jail cell. We're not sure if it hit him or not, but what killed him was when he fell out of the back window of the jail and broke his neck. So anyway, terrible event. But the Mormons end up getting taken over and led by Brigham Young. And BYU is the most famous Mormon university today. And so basically one of the things that Brigham Young did, is he's known for, is taking in 1847, a large group, about 10,000, crossed the Great Plains and went into Utah, which hadn't been settled by any other really American group. Now, it was heavily settled by Native Americans. And so they settled around the Great Salt Lake Valley in present-day Utah, which is where Salt Lake City is. And so they used cooperative labor, an elaborate irrigation system based on communal water rights. The Mormon pioneers transformed the region. They quickly spread plant agricultural communities along the base of the Wasatch Mountain Range, and many Mormons who rejected polygamy remained in the U.S. But under the leadership of Smith's son, Joseph Smith III, they formed the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and settled throughout the Midwest. So the Mormon group that moves to Utah is probably the most famous one in American history, but another kind of, because they split in Missouri, and the other group is led by Joseph Smith III. So when the U.S. bought the Southwest from Mexico, the Mormons asked to have a new state called Deseret. Congress decided no, that they gave them a much smaller territory called Utah, with Brigham Young as the governor. Anyway, but later, President James Buchanan in the late 1850s tried to eliminate polygamy and removed Young as the governor. Okay. Here's Brigham Young, picture of him. So this is the map I was talking about. So they started in kind of western New York, went to Kirkland in far northeastern Ohio, then went to Independence, Missouri. And then that's when they split. And then the biggest group was in Nauvoo, Illinois. And then when Joseph Smith was killed, Brigham Young took about 10,000, and they went all the way out to the Salt Lake City area. And you can see in the color area on the western half of the United States where a lot of the Mormons settled. And so a lot of that area of the country is still large Mormon population.